Most accounts of the economic history of the Polish People's Republic construct a dichotomy between rational economists on the one side and dogmatic or ideological party apparatchiks on the other. Now, this presentation doesn't really describe any genuine debate because only one side is granted any intellectual legitimacy. We're presented with a struggle between well-meaning, unbiased, scientific economists and, on the other side, unsophisticated, hardline functionaries interested only in power. But a closer look at the documents, particularly from the 1950s, reveals that instead of a Manichaean struggle between reason and dogma, or between economics and politics, we find a profound clash, something much deeper, about values and value in the economic and the more general sense of that word, about the goals of socialism, and about the relevance of history. At the very origin of economics as a field of thought, Adam Smith had distinguished between value and price, using the phrases natural price for what would later be called value, and distinguish it from market price. His late 19th century successors, however, wanted to systemize their discipline more, to make it more scientific. Smith's concept of natural price, value, was an ethical concept. It was the just price, the good price. But later economists decided that ethical values couldn't be operationalized. So neoclassical economists simply announced that the cost of an item was, by definition, the same as its value. Things were worth what the market said they were worth, and value only even existed in processes of exchange. Some socialists accepted these methods, many others did not. In the USSR, economists were initially pretty reluctant to reduce the concept of value to a mathematically expressed, market-determined price. The early work of the Soviet scholar Leonid Kantorovich was viewed with suspicion in the Soviet Union precisely for these reasons, because he did seem to reduce value to price. Whether that's fair or not is another question. Although for his part, Kantorovich did scoff at his opponents for using a historical interpretive method rather than a mathematical one. As he put it, the computer cannot digest some of our economists' scholarly products. After pouring out all the water, there's nothing left, or just one big question mark, the formulation of an unsolved problem, end quote. Now, for those who were the object of Kantorovich's attack here, the computer was indeed somewhat incidental to economics, because for them, the key to understanding the economy was not math, but history. In 1943, a group of 10 prominent Soviet economists, led by Lev Leontiev, the author of the country's standard textbook on political economy, published a much-discussed essay that Stalin would later use as the inspiration for his own book on economics, uncredited, of course. Here, they argued that there were economic laws, of course, but like any social laws, these were specific to specific contexts, to specific historical eras. So some would apply to socialism, and others would apply to capitalism. The law of value was one example of a principle that was said to change over time. Under capitalism, the phrase, everything has its price, is more than a mere aphorism, really. Everything is, in theory, subjected to the forces of supply and demand. Everything, in other words, is commodified. Now, socialism was supposed to change that. The Polish economist Bronisław Mink wrote that the main difference between bourgeois and socialist economists was that the bourgeois economists studied how people related to things, and socialist economists studied how people related to each other. With such a methodology, he continued, capitalists could only understand value in very narrow materialist terms, while socialists could see a bigger picture. And I quote, "The goal of capitalist production is not the satisfaction of the needs of society, nor the creation of use value in service of that objective. Consumption is necessary for capitalism only insofar as it enables the attainment of profit." Now, the goal of the socialist planner, Mink said, was to assess what people need, and in doing so, market prices could sometimes be a useful piece of information. However, quote, "It is of course necessary to differentiate between the categories of value and price. Price, resulting from its very nature, is not the same as value, and it must diverge from it." End quote. So price was a discernible statistical figure, but value couldn't be pinned down so easily. And that was why authors like Mink thought it was dangerous for economists to proceed too far down the path of mathematical abstraction. Now, obviously, one must utilize math as an economist, wrote Mink, I quote again, "but one must decisively avoid the use in economic research of the so-called mathematical method, as conceived by many contemporary bourgeois economists, which in reality is an attempt to replace research into the essence of a phenomenon with the erection of formal constructs that have nothing in common with reality. Applying mathematics to political economy has more than once led bourgeois economists to concepts that are entirely artificial, unreal." End quote. Mink's view was always contested in Poland, and it dominated only briefly from 1948 until Stalin's death in 1953. Almost immediately after Stalin's death, economists began discussing more openly the reforms that many of them thought were necessary. And the key word that would become very common in their conversations was actually neologism at the time in Polish. The word was uekonomicznienie. Now, this literally would translate as economize or economization, but it implies more than just stinginess or frugality. Rather, it refers to a fundamental transformation in economic thought, away from fuzzy concepts like history or ethics, towards mathematics. It was a movement to develop an understanding of the economics profession as a universal science that functioned by the same rules and principles in both socialism and capitalism. Anyone who dissented from this more narrowly understood concept of economics was deemed by the reform economists in Poland to be really not an economist at all. That person was a dogmatist or an ideologue who believed in, to use another slogan of the time, volunteerism. Speaking at the Second Convention of Polish Economists, which is a momentous academic gathering in 1956, if that's not a contradiction in terms, Oskar Lange announced the emergence of a new professional consensus. Quote, "Finally, there exists an entirely united view among us, namely, that our national economy needs full and effective economic accounting." It's telling that the most excitement at that particular convention was generated by Michał Kalecki's presentation, which was also by far the most technical, filled with very subtle and precise argumentation and abundant mathematical equations. It's the only paper that would have been challenging for outsiders to understand, which may have been one of the reasons why it was so appealing to the insiders. Apparently, the attendees, particularly the younger ones, were inspired by how Kalecki made economics seem intellectually sophisticated and mathematically rigorous, devoid of the philosophical and moral fluff of more orthodox Marxists. And this was by far the most oft-mentioned message of the conference attendees. They wanted to move away from ideology to science. One of the speakers from the floor, they didn't even bother with the pretense of Q&A, they just stood up and spoke, said this and captured the mood really well. He said, "It is necessary to introduce a precise differentiation between the science and the politics of economics, which might be tightly connected, but are nonetheless entirely different. The tasks placed before us by science are testable, subject to logical and empirical verification. On the other hand, the tasks that make up a political program, despite being based on scientific premises, have a normative character and relate to a certain system of goals. A system of goals can, of course, be justified, but the goals themselves cannot be subjected in a sufficient manner to scientific verification." Edward Lipinski, who would later become a prominent opposition activist, but was at the time still a member of the Communist Party, and to his dying day considered himself a socialist, he was one of the most respected scholars to speak at the convention, and the eldest at the time as well. He summed up the implication of this scientific approach to economics by outlining a new understanding of value and prices. Quote from Lipinski, "Capital is a social relationship, and as such, it doesn't contain within itself anything material, but capital is expressed in money. It is a measurable quantity. It is touchable. It is a quantity that is based, like everything else, on material quantity. Construction workers, assessing the durability of materials, are dealing with the same material, quantifiable objects, as are economists. The law of value governs prices. Market value constitutes the gravitational point of prices." Just pause on that sentence because it's a fascinating inversion of Adam Smith. The law of value governs prices. Market value constitutes the gravitational point of prices. But the level of prices themselves, or changes in prices, generate automatically a change in supply and demand. They generate a reaction that must be analyzed, end quote. So by defining economics in this very telling way, it became possible to sever ties with soft fields like philosophy, politics, and of course history, and line up alongside biology, chemistry, engineering, construction, as in that example, or physics. As one of the pro-reform economists speaking from the floor at the 1956 convention put it, quote, "The flaws of the Stalinist definition of the subject of economics is that instead of drawing attention to typical purely economic elements like price, cost, income, money, etc., they accentuate social relations within them, thus losing that which is economic about the subject of social sciences in their entirety." So from this supposedly scientific foundation, Lipinski inserted commodity valuation into socialism kind of through the back door. The labor theory of value had been based on the amount of socially necessary labor, in Marx's phrase, that would be contributed to a product. Lipinski relocated this calculation to the realm of consumption instead of production. He said, "Only by selling a good to a producer or consumer can I measure whether the amount of labor used in creating it was socially necessary, whether it corresponded to the needs of society. If I contributed too much labor in the production of a machine that manufactures a consumer good, the demand for that good will show whether the amount of labor was or was not in accordance with the social need." So demand was established here as the measure of value. Market demand is the measure of value. And it followed then, quote, "If therefore a product appears as a value, it has a monetary price, which functions according to the law of value, which makes price equal to value," end quote. Now, once value and price were collapsed together, equilibrium became much more than an accounting mechanism. It became, as Lipinski put it, an immanent law, pravo immanente. mandating that whenever a price diverged from its ideal equilibrium price, some sort of disturbance, zaburzenie, must follow. Pricing under socialism, he wrote, should regulate production in exactly the same way as pricing under capitalism. Włodzimierz Bruce, one of the leading reform economists, went so far as to argue that, quote, a price that does not balance supply and demand is not fundamentally an economically justified price. If the price is lower than the equilibrium price, it can only be sustained with the help of administrative means, a rationing system, or at the cost of such phenomena as hoarding commodities and lines outside of stores. In this manner of framing the issue, we see the core argument here. Instead of entertaining the possibility that under specific circumstances, different paths to equilibrium might be justified, he simply announced, again, by definition, that any method other than pricing was illegitimate. All our alternatives were what he called administrative methods instead of the proper economic methods, or as he put it even more sharply elsewhere, it was the command principle instead of the economic principle. So economics gets positioned here as opposed to and juxtaposing against authority or power. Opposing all this, Maximilian Porter-Szűcs, a sort of more, I guess we'd say, orthodox Marxist from a slightly earlier time, responded to this growing consensus that price equaled value in his contribution to a 1957 book that you see here with the attention-grabbing title, Economists Discuss the Law of Value. They sure knew how to market books back then. Anyway, here's what Porter-Szűcs said, quote, there are two paths for adapting production to consumer need. First, the spontaneous method of a capitalist economy. Second, the conscious adaptation of a planned socialist economy, end quote. And it really was, he said, it was an either-or decision. Because in the socialist system, the whole premise of supply and demand pricing didn't function, he said. We must not fetishize prices or price equilibrium, he wrote, because we must carry out a specific social policy. If we continue to treat price equilibrium as a fetish, then the only means of resolving difficulties in, say, meat supply would be to raise its price. Lines are unfortunate, but in some situations they are the only option if there is, say, not enough meat. Raising the price of meat is not a solution for those who can't buy the meat at a higher price. So a world in which prices were based on supply and demand, he said, would be a world in which commodification returned, and in its wake would come the logic of capitalism. If profit was the goal, and if price was treated as an objective reality based on supply and demand, then incentives would be aimed at lowering costs and maximizing prices. And certainly no socialist wanted that. Even Bruce, one of the leading reformists, said that they must never allow firms to compete for profits by lowering pay, even as Bruce told firms that their fundamental goal should be the maximization of profit. Similarly, he wanted firms to set their own prices, yet he also wanted to believe that, quote, from Bruce, there exists in general a concept of the economic interest of the nation as a whole, which is not entirely covered by the interests of specific firms or directly by the interests of citizens as consumers, end quote. Lipinski agreed. In a socialist economy, he wrote, the decisive factor is social profit, that is, the socioeconomic effects of a particular investment, an effect that is not at all limited to a particular factory or even one branch of production. End quote there. So once we understood this concept of social profit, Lipinski continued, we can also see that, quote, the superiority of socialism depends on the fact that it creates the possibility of suspending or limiting the functioning of the law of value. Now, it's certainly understandable that these economists, as socialists, wanted to limit the effects of equilibrium prices. But on what theoretical grounds had they left themselves to do so? Now, they could make ad hoc determinations that market pricing would apply in one case, but not another. But their goal was to turn economics into a science and avoid subjective political judgments. The whole project then was undermined by the self-evident politics involved in determining how far commodification should go. And a particular problem, in fact, I would argue the fatal problem for this whole worldview, regarded wages, which weren't supposed to be commodified at all under socialism. In the early 1950s, students at the Main School for Planning and Statistics, known by its acronym of ESCAPIS, they were taught that, quote, according to one lecturer, liquidating the private ownership of the means of production and the exploitation of people by people on the basis of a socialized means of production means first and foremost that labor power ceases to be a commodity. It is unnecessary to emphasize that this is the initial moment that determines the character of commodity production in socialism. End quote. But if labor costs were not priced according to the same valuation system as everything else, then the largest single expense on most firms' ledgers was excluded. So ultimately, the dilemma faced by these reformists was that they wanted to have their neoclassical cake and eat it too. They wanted both a scientific means of determining real prices, but they could never quite follow through on the claim that they made that price and value were the same thing. They wanted to do that, but they also wanted to believe that it was possible to use a concept of social value that was not determined by market prices. Above all, they couldn't really be socialists and simultaneously believe that labor should be treated as a commodity. Already in 1958, one of the lead reformists, Czesław Bobrowski, cautioned that commodity pricing was just, quote, a certain tendency and not a misleading hope of solving the broad problems of planning and management through the direct application of the law of value, even though he was one of the ones who was advocating for the embrace of the law of value. As the years went on, Polish economists increasingly used price as if it was the same as value, and the spheres of the economy in which they did so expanded and expanded, eventually by the 1980s, reaching labor itself. They were less and less inclined throughout this whole process to remind themselves of what they had said back in the 1950s, that price and value weren't actually the same thing.